Schopenhauer makes a comment that nature is always truthful. It's a strange statement, isn't it? He makes that statement over and over again within the world as will and representation. What he's saying is that nothing is hidden. It's all out there. You can see what nature is just by looking. And yet, most people don't do that. They have to put a layer of fantasy or imagination over the top of it. So I want to talk about violence in this podcast. Because nature is demonstrably violent. Everything about nature spells violence. Yeah, I mean, there are obvious examples of that. Animals in most species will fight for mating rights. We have to kill things to eat them. Your body is constantly being challenged by viruses, bacteria, fungi. They want to eat you. And so your body has to fight those things all the time. And of course, prior to us gaining reasonable weapons, we were prey for pretty much any animal that was larger than us and like meat. And we kill billions of small creatures. Well, not so small as well. Cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, every day to eat them. In your social life, the main, as Spinoza says, the main driver very often for people is envy. People want to have the most prestige. They want best access to mating partners. They want more power, more money, more fame. And of course, this is a competitive scenario. So lying, cheating, stealing, acts of violence, which is what these are, lying, cheating and stealing against another person. All these things take place because nature is essentially violent. And as I've mentioned before, the Andromeda Galaxy will collide with our own galaxy in a couple of billion years, and that will be a pretty violent event. What do we mean by violence? Well, violence is always when one thing, one entity, imposes its will on another. This is more visible in everyday life. When you go to work, someone is imposing upon you a certain regime that you have to conform to so you can get money. The whole of nature is based on this kind of thing. The runts and the animals lower down the pecking order have to conform to the manner and the desires of the animals near the top of the pecking order. So remember that violence is when one thing imposes its will upon another. And this is the way nature is structured, at least as we see it. One thing always having to impose its will and to disadvantage another thing to survive. Eating other things being the classic example. So this is the external world. It would be folly to expect anything in the world to not be violent. The whole thing is built on violence. It's not just that men are violent. The universe is violent. Creatures are violent towards one another. We're not aberrant in our behaviour, in our violent behaviour. We possibly do it on a bigger scale than most other animals, but all the same, it's the same thing. Violence is required to survive. So this is the external world. Let me emphasize that. The external world being your interaction with other creatures, other things. It's all based on violence, and there's almost nothing you can do about it. Spinoza, in part 3 of the Ethics, goes to in great detail, and in part 4, to try and outline how men could behave differently as a group. But that's not going to happen any day soon, if ever. That men of reason would agree to try and benefit each other for their own mutual advantage. The violence is too deep within us. We come from nature. Of course, all of this is very, very difficult for people to accept. It's difficult because they want a happy ever after story. If the world is violent, then they feel that maybe they're at risk in some way. So they'll pick out examples like, the bees pollinate the flowers and all the plants, and so on. Well, yes, they do, but it's it's all for their own advantage. It's not like they're going out there and doing a job of work for the sake of the flowers. They're doing it because they want the pollen. And people try and pick any old thing. Oh, look at how this elephant saved this so-and-so. And, occasionally those things happen for reasons that aren't exactly clear. But generally speaking, look at nature, and it's one thing savaging another, either physically or psychologically. So, in your life, do not be surprised that you have been savaged psychologically, because that is the nature of life. Let me, sort of triply emphasize that. The nature of life is violence and savagery. So that people like to think it's an exception when it happens. It isn't the exception, it's the norm, it's the rule. The exception would be someone helping you and being kind towards you. So, that's the external world. So let's talk about the internal world, your internal world. If you want an internal world that is worth anything, somehow you have to get the violence out of it. You can't let violence in there. This violence takes place in many ways. One is obviously self-judgment, self-loathing and hatred, which is very common. We have these things largely through conditioning. So maybe we had a parent who was particularly cruel to us, who put us down all the time, maybe. Or we had a hard time at school because of something. Maybe we had a slight disfigurement. You know what kids are like? Kids are vicious little bastards. We paint children as these innocent things. They're not innocent things. They're unbelievably cruel. I remember when I was a kid, I did some things that were not... I look back at it and I think, what the fuck were you doing? Fairly unpleasant things to other kids. Anyway, so those things generate scars, which we then take with us. And as Gurdjieff said, within us we are many people. In fact, we're not many, we're an infinite number of people. This idea that there are some traits that are dominant, but basically we're this continuum of behaviors and ideas and emotions and so on. And so we introject is the word that is used, behaviors from others. So if your father or mother was always saying you're a useless piece of shit, which is actually more common than you might think, then we grow up and we introject that, and there's a part of us just saying that whatever we do is never good enough, that all our efforts are crap, and that violence is taken within us. We introject it from the environment, because the environment is violent. Its very nature is violence. can't stress that enough. Do not see violence as an exception. It's the norm. It's the way nature works. So, to go back to our internal life, we need to find some way to bring peace, to not allow the violence of the external world to come within us. Although, you know, by the time you're 20, there's going to be a good bit of it in there, and then you spend the rest of your life trying to understand what the fuck is going on. So, someone I knew years ago was talking about unconditional love. He was a great man. And, he quickly dismissed the bullshit about, I unconditionally love my children, I unconditionally love my partner, I unconditionally love my parents, blah, blah, blah. Well, the bond with children is very strong, clearly, because they carry your genes. But unconditional love, what the fuck does that mean? Anyway, he went on to say the only unconditional love we should even consider is unconditional love towards ourselves, within ourselves. What does that mean? It means that we take pleasure in ourselves. We don't criticize what's going on in there. Because which bit of you is doing the criticizing? Which bit of you has the judgment and the knowledge to criticize another part? So in my case, I mentioned it before, I'm an incredibly impatient person. I like it. For many years I would look at the way that I behave and I think, oh God, Martin, you really ought to be more patient, blah, blah, blah. And then you see religious statements or spiritual statements, patience is the mother of the will and all this shit, and I used to think, oh Martin, you're so you're so inadequate because you're such an impatient son of a bitch. And then I learned to love my impatience. I learned to love my fears and my sorrows and my enthusiasms. I'm a little bit like Toad of Toad Hall, if you've ever read Wind in the Willows. Something new comes along, woo, I'm off there. I used to criticize that within myself. Now I love it. So, as Spinoza says, we should love ourselves unconditionally. He doesn't use the word unconditionally. No matter what's going on in there, no matter what we think we've done that has been wrong or whatever, no matter what we see in ourselves that we think is aberrant behaviour, not the norm, according to some spiritual arsehole or some religious arsehole or some psychological arsehole, no matter what we think is wrong with ourselves, given the standards that these people put out, actually to love what we are. Oh my God, that's such a... for most people, that notion of, well, yeah, you're impatient, you're bad-tempered, you're this, you're that, you're something else. I love all those things. That's such a challenge to most people. Most people have bought in somewhere to the idea that they are deficient or something and need to fix themselves. Anyway, so non-judgment, to fully accept yourself as you are, and to take delight in your own inner being. All of it, warts and all. Of course, they're not warts, really, they're just parts of you. Society doesn't want to hear that, because society is based on violence, like everything else. So the idea that someone can be fully at peace with themselves and accept all the things within themselves that society would see as flaws is a great threat to society. So you never talk to anybody about it. Anyway, I think that's about it. Two things to remember. External life is based on violence. It only knows violence. There is nothing else that it knows. Kill or be killed. Dominate or be dominated. Exploit or be exploited. That's the way it works. That is its fundamental mechanism. If you don't want all that shit inside yourself, you have to consciously work at becoming your own lover, effectively. To love yourself within, no matter what's in there, to take pleasure in it. And never ever to judge. And if you find yourself judging, don't judge the fucking judgment. Just accept it. Oh, I'm a judging, I'm a judging little bastard. Just judge. And the heat goes out of it. So, the external world is what it is. You have to operate in it, but do not ingest any of the shit that's going on. Your own inner world should become your own inner sanctum, the place where there is no violence.